Our articles are popular at salon.com, xnet, and iet.org. So how long is this, buddy?
That sounds fantastic.
That sounds fantastic to you. Our YouTube channel, The Waypoint, offers resources for recovering evangelicals and others who want to better understand the psychology of biblical Christian belief. Tarico is actively engaged in dialogue that aims to find the common ground between theists and freethinkers, in particular by focusing on humanity's shared moral core. She is the founder of wisdomcommons.org, an interactive site that allows users to find and discuss information about virtues that emerge repeatedly across secular and religious wisdom traditions. A related series of parenting articles, Character Corner, can be found at the Community of Mindful Parents. A complete set of our articles is available at thewaypoint.wordpress.com. Please welcome Valerie Tarico. You still there?
I'm still here. Can you hear me?
All right. All yours.
Thanks for having me speak to your group tonight. This is definitely a new genre of communication for me, and so you should feel free to interrupt if at any point I become unintelligible or if the visuals aren't working or whatever. I want to talk to you this evening about why and how Christianity leads good people to become bullies, and specifically why queers, women, and kids are the targets of that bullying. So I'm going to talk through a slide deck that I put together, mostly just some images to remind me of things that I wanted to say, and then we'll open up for questions afterwards. Is everything working so far? Hello?
Sorry, Valerie. Yep, we're good. We're good.
Okay, you're muted. All right, I'll go ahead. I, of course, as far as I can tell, I'm just talking to myself in an empty room, but I will carry on here. So one of the ways that I think about Christianity is that what it does is it binds people to the moral priorities of the Iron Age. And specifically, the more a person is convinced that the Bible is the literally perfect word of God, the more Iron Age, if you will, their priorities are going to be. And that is because the Bible, even though it contains a variety of texts, it's aggregated over hundreds of years, what it does is it embodies or embeds a specific worldview that people don't even necessarily realize they're being indoctrinated into. So they may take the stories at face value. They may be trying to scan the Bible, as most Christians are, for things that they find specifically uplifting or morally affirmative, or things that create a sense of goodness, of righteousness, of community, of wonder, of joy. But beneath that, the fact is that there is a landscape of reality, if you will, that is being promulgated, or kind of, it's the background of that biblical worldview. And so people don't even realize that what they are doing is absorbing the moral priorities and the perceptions of the authors with regard to what's real and what's not real, even when those things may not have a whole lot to do with the surface text of what it is that a person is reading about. So I know that most of you have heard of, kind of people talk about the Bible or about Christianity or about religions broadly as something that essentially operates as a mind virus. And I have this picture of an ant here to remind us of kind of flukes that, again, you may have heard of the analogy that the life cycle of some flukes is that they actually need to not only get pooped out by cattle and then ultimately kind of absorbed by the body of the ant, but that then they need to alter the behavior of the ant, which leaves its nest and climbs up a grass stalk so that it can be eaten by the cattle, to perpetuate the life cycle of the fluke. And I put this in here to remind you and to remind myself that Christianity, as any religion, especially any kind of powerful viral religion, is going to kind of exert a great deal of mind control, if you will, over its hosts for the purpose of self-replication of the religion itself. And that may or may not be advantageous to the host. It may be detrimental or it may be beneficial, but either way, what we know is that the selective pressures on the religion as a viral self-replicator, that some call a meme complex, are operating to perpetuate religion, not necessarily the well-being of the hosts. And because of that, what you find in many religions is that apostasy itself is one of the most abhorrent sins. I put this slide up again because we hear that in Islam, but we also find that among Christians, there's often a real disdain for and moral judgment towards people who have actively considered and rejected Christianity, or people who have been Christians and then have rejected Christianity. That if you just say to somebody, "Oh, I'm not religious," then the Christian may perceive you as somebody who's open to potentially becoming religious and specifically becoming Christian. But if you say I'm a former Christian, or if you say I'm an ex-Christian, or if you say I'm an atheist, meaning I've thought about this and I'm actively choosing to reject it, then you become morally abominable. One of the ways that Christianity operates then is by creating a sense of tribalism. There are insiders and outsiders. Then the insiders are people who are morally trustworthy, they're righteous, they're good. They are the people who are saved, they're the people who are going to heaven, they're the people who deserve good things to happen to them, they're people who should be the beneficiaries of your altruism. And then there are people who are tribal outsiders. And in a religion like Christianity, which is kind of predicated on right belief, what the kind of outsiders are often people whose beliefs are perceived as wrong-headed. So this is a picture of a Samaritan woman, a modern-day Samaritan woman in Palestine. And what you know probably from the story of the Good Samaritan, if for no other reason, is that the Samaritans in biblical times were considered to be lesser beings. They were considered to be kind of heathens or outsiders. In reality, they were from the Hebrew tradition, and they were people who only accepted the Torah as the kind of scripture, if you will. So they didn't go on to add other scriptures of their own, and they rejected the rest of the Hebrew Bible. And as a consequence, the Pharisees and Sadducees of Jesus' time and the mainstream orthodoxy of Judaism considered them to be another tribe, and so therefore unworthy. And so one of the ways that Christianity then creates kind of lesser humans, or makes certain people into second-class citizens, is people who are perceived as apostates, or people who are perceived as infidels, people who are perceived as religious outsiders. But within Christianity itself, there is also a hierarchy of value that is placed on people. And that hierarchy of value is what I want to focus in more on today. Not the second-class status of outsiders to Christianity, but the second-class status of people who are within Christianity. And specifically, I want to focus on people who are LGBTQ, women and children, and why it is that of all of the people kind of in our world, these are the people who Christians, and specifically American evangelicals today, are most intent on keeping down.
Valerie?
So I want,
Valerie?
yes.
Just real quick, if you point to the image that you want to show, then we can see it. Otherwise, we're just going to see the first slide.
I've been tabbing through them. Sorry. So it's not showing you the screen that I'm seeing?
Oh, okay. Well, no worries. Then we'll just keep going. I don't know. That's weird.
Let me go back to, sorry, you must be stuck on the slide that, let me see if I minimize this. What do you get now?
I see you.
You see me?
If you bring it back up.
Uh-huh.
If you click on the left, actually on the picture itself on the left, then it would come up for us.
Okay. So for some reason I've got full screen on another screen, but if I toggle to it, it's not letting you see it. Is that right?
That's correct. Yeah, so if you bring it back up.
Do you know how to? This is reading view. How does that work? Sorry, can you tell me what you're seeing at this point?
Yeah, actually, if you go back, you might have to click share screen again. Back to the feed and just hit share.
Okay. So if I go screen share and then I go here, now what are you seeing?
I'm still seeing you.
You're still seeing anchored to the Iron Age?
Unfortunately, but so if we do, so did you click screen share and hit that button again?
Sorry about this.
This is all a learning experience for everyone.
I'm suspecting that what I need to do is tell it to do full screen on this slide on this particular screen, but I don't know quite what to do.
Try full screen on the other.
Where is that?
That would be your PowerPoint itself. So that would be at the bottom of your, or the bottom. I don't know. Do you have a Mac or a PC?
I have a PC.
You have two screens at home office? As I can see the PowerPoint on screen, but we don't get that other screen. So
I've got two screens showing. One is the PowerPoint slideshow, and then one is the one that you must be getting.
Right. So switch those. Just move one to the other physically, like dragging and dropping.
All right, I'm going to close this screen and see what happens.
So, so you hit screen share and it still is the same?
It is.
I actually you sent an email, correct?
Sorry?
You sent me the PowerPoint email?
I did. I mean, I can actually tab through these here. It's just that you'll have all of the border stuff. Like, does that change the screen for you?
No, it's still you on the screen.
It's still me. That's somewhat horrifying.
No, it isn't at all. So what I'll do is I'll open up the
Oh, here, let's see. Let me try one more.
otherwise I can just open up your presentation and tab through it.
If I do this, is it sharing this one?
There we go. Perfect. So we're on the diversity.
So what are you seeing now?
Guys, this is religious liberty slide.
Are you okay now?
Yep.
So are you seeing now a Samaritan woman?
Perfect. Yeah, that's perfect. So I'm just gonna mute us again on this side. Good to go.
Okay, so, all right, so you know, to carry forward, one of the things that modernist Christians and people who have perhaps more benign view of faith than I do often say is that the kind of bigotry that comes out of Christianity towards, in particular, LGBTQ people or women, or even, you know, some of the stuff again towards children, the idea that people should be able to beat their children, is actually bigotry disguised as religious liberty. But what I would actually argue is that, in fact, Christians and other people who ascribe to the idea that some sect offers them the literally perfect word of God, whether that's via a sacred text or whether that's via some authoritarian tradition, it's not bigotry disguised as religious liberty. The religion itself actually embeds the bigotry and obligates people to behave in bigoted ways. So to the extent that a person feels compelled to live according to biblical principles, it's not being disguised as religious liberty. That what their religion requires of them is to adopt attitudes and behaviors that actually are bigoted and that actually do harm in the world. And that is one reason that religious freedom claims really quite often are claims, people claiming the right to do things that are legitimately sanctified by their religion, but also that are legitimately harmful. So it creates this kind of double bind in the world. And they rarely make religious freedom claims about things that aren't harmful, in fact, because most kind of religious behaviors that aren't harmful are already well protected by our long legal tradition, at least in this country. So when you see people using the words religious liberty today, or they're making religious freedom claims, they're not asking for the freedom to they're not asking for freedom of thought. They're not asking for the freedom to meet with other like-minded people. They're not asking for the freedom to believe differently than the majority. They're not asking for the freedom to wear odd clothes, or even the freedom to teach their children peculiar things or religious things or things that are contradicted by science. They are most often asking for exceptions to laws that are in place to otherwise create a coherent functioning society and to safeguard minorities from harm. So again, what you'll see on the internet and what you hear in conversations is this idea that religious freedom doesn't mean the freedom to force everyone to follow your religion. But if you are an evangelical Christian like I was, if you grew up in Bible-believing Christianity and think that you have been told, go into the world and preach the gospel, make disciples of every creature, if you believe that because of your biblical worldview that Christians are obligated to take control of the reins of power and to kind of script our society according to biblical principles, then in fact religious freedom actually does mean the freedom to force everyone else to follow your religion. And so as much as we might like to think that there is a non-zero sum, I guess, solution here, to the extent that Christianity obligates people to live according to certain biblical principles, certain Iron Age principles, there's going to be winners and losers. And as Christianity is being sort of fought back in terms of holding a kind of decreasing percent of American mind share and even a decreasing market share from among the religions in this country, what people are perceiving and experiencing losses because in actuality within their worldview those losses are real. So when I said what I said before was that we need to kind of remember that there are going to be actual trade-offs here. These kind of restroom bills, the kind of bathroom bills that are we're currently fighting about and that seem utterly ridiculous have to do with the fact that, again, Christians feel obligated to behave in certain ways, and the moral precepts in the Bible, the way it treats insiders and tribal outsiders, the way that it kind of talks about sexuality, puts people in a position, and I think even really genuinely decent people in a position that then they are afraid of things that they don't need to be afraid of because they are literally incapable of understanding certain realities, like the reality that somebody could be born transgender, like the reality that somebody could be born some other kind of queer, because that doesn't fit this worldview that's been scripted by their faith tradition. And I want to also say that it's not just in this country political conservatives who have this view of faith, that faith is benign, that we can somehow, if we just are tolerant enough, that there's kind of space for science and religion, that there's space for all religions to kind of be mutually accommodating. I you know, what I see from the left half of the political spectrum, which is where I sit, is that there are a good number of people who refuse to believe that Islam could possibly be incompatible with plurality, with gender equality, with secularism, and with equal rights for gay people. So what we have on, I think, both on the left half of the spectrum is a refusal to acknowledge the power of religion and the fact that it can create a very narrow cognitive operating range for people and can basically take control of and channel people's moral emotions. And then what you see on the right half of the political spectrum often is people who perfectly do understand that because they're living it, and yet are bound to the priorities of their own religion as a viral self-replicator. So there's been some recent attempt to kind of fend off these religious freedom claims by people who are starting to realize that unfettered religious freedom inevitably means the freedom to do harm. And just this month, 2 Democratic congressmen, I believe, introduced legislation. They don't expect that it will pass anytime soon until we kind of have some real changes at the top in our country. But there's a recognition that we need to circumscribe the power of religion, that it needs to be secondary and subject to civil society and to the ability of people to live in community with each other. So now I want to talk about 3 different populations that I said within the biblical worldview are lesser beings, and why it is that women, that people who kind of, including queer people who are kind of opting out of procreation, and then children are particularly stigmatized and are particularly vulnerable to being harmed by Christian dominant cultures. So if you go back to that, you know, that comment I made about being anchored to the Iron Age, what you see is that within the Iron Age worldview, there's a very specific set of roles that are inextricably bound together in a non-negotiable way. And that is that the household, the social structure, is organized around family and kin groups in a patriarchal society, which means, of course, the male head as the owner of the household. That within that structure, marriage, sex, and childbearing are bound together inseparably as a package. And part of the reason for that is that women and children are literally economic assets of men, governed not by rights law, but by property law. If you look at the Old Testament, women and children fall into the same category as household possessions, as slaves, and as livestock. And so in that worldview, sexual intimacy and pleasure, parenthood and family formation cannot happen separate from each other. And yet, if you look at what's happening in the evolution of our society currently, what we see is that people who are liberals, people who aren't bound to this ancient worldview, want the ability and the freedom to choose each of these things independent from the other two. So there are people who want to be able to have non-procreative sex. They don't want to have to become family with each other in order to have sex. They don't want to have to become parents in order to be able to enjoy sexual intimacy or pleasure. Similarly, we have people who want to become parents who may not, that you may become parents via adoption. In the future, we may have, you know, babies that are produced in ways other than being incubated inside of a woman's body. And likewise, we have people who want to be able to commit to each other to become family, either informally or formally, that may have nothing to do with this sort of male-female relationship, that it may not involve parenthood. It may not even involve sex. There are people who choose, for example, in their waning years to make intimate family commitments to each other that may have nothing to do with legal agreements, that may not involve sexual intimacy, but that involve other kinds of intimacy or mutual support. And the same is true for people as we now, who are asexual, for example, as we now understand asexuality as one of the variations in human libido that is part of the normal spectrum And yet people who are asexual may also desire both intimacy and parenthood. So I don't need to tell you that queer people of all kinds are targeted, that this comes specifically out of the Bible and the biblical worldview. Yes, as kind of many people have argued, especially liberal Christians have argued, the people who choose to to denigrate homosexuality or to denigrate you know, the whole idea that somebody, to deny the science of us being born with a kind of sexual orientation and gender identity partially or at least or largely in place, that oftentimes those people are choosing to ignore other parts of the Bible, but the evolution of biblical Christianity is such that there is a, if you will, lag time between cultural evolution, the way that kind of culture moves forward and moral consciousness moves forward, and then the way that Christians, unfortunately, are very often at sort of the tail end of that movement, because what the biblical view does is it creates, and then the religious structures and the way that religious ideas get transmitted is they actually kind of create a more static or stable or slow moving form of a cultural identity. And that is in fact precisely what they're intended to do, right? They're intended to kind of transmit ideas in a coherent and consistent way from generation to generation. Oftentimes those are ideas that in the context in which they first evolved were actually adaptive, but now have become, in a different technological context, in a different social context, in a different economic context and ecological context, have become maladaptive. So what you see in response, is that Christians in this country are moving rapidly, especially young Christians, towards a changing view of gay people, but that Christianity itself isn't leading that charge, it's creating resistance. So for example, this is from an kind of event a couple years ago in which this big global nonprofit that is owned and operated by evangelicals and that exists partly for the purpose of transmitting Christian ideas, decided to expand their hiring practices to include gays. Now, mind you, they still won't hire non-Christians. They've taken, in fact, their hiring practices all the way to the Supreme Court to defend their right not only to reject people who are non-Christians, but even to reject people who are non-literalist Christians. But they had, given the cultural nexus and kind of tradition and the kind of changing moral consciousness of young evangelicals, they tried to make this shift, and what they ended up with is so many evangelical Christians dropping their sponsorship of desperate children in poor countries that they ended up reversing their stance. Eventually, they're going to come along, but it's the adherence to and the sanctification, elevation of these ideas from the Iron Age that make it so difficult for Christians to come along in the present. So I'm sure many of you have seen this slide before or something analogous, but the reason that, I mean, gay sex and the idea of intimacy between two men or two women is so abominable to many Christians is because in this worldview that we were just talking about with that triangle, partnership and sex exist for the purpose of procreation. And they are, and then basically, as I said, children and women are economic assets, that marriage exists in order to produce children of known lineage, of known paternity, I guess. And so if you look at all of these different models that are biblical, many of them are abhorrent to us. And yet what each of them does do is it guarantees known paternity of those babies, which was the point of the whole system. So when we then move from kind of looking at gay people to looking at women, this is kind of what really the opposition to reproductive rights and women's sexual autonomy is all about. And what you know is that you probably also know that in the Bible, as I said, women are literally economic assets. That's one of the reasons that if a woman violates her own kind of virginity, which makes her more valuable, because then you can be confident who has caused her to become pregnant, that if she has sex outside of marriage voluntarily, she can be stoned, but that and killed. But if somebody violates her and the rapist is known, her father can essentially sell her. We're taught that in the Bible that basically there's a price that should be paid. He has to essentially purchase the damaged goods and then is forced to keep her for life. So the idea is, it sounds really twisted, but it is akin to the idea that if you have a purebred dog, you want to breed that dog with another purebred dog. You need to know kind of who the sire is in order to maximize the value of those puppies. So what you see then, if you look at the Old Testament, is this kind of steady stream of women being vessels for powerful men. And when my daughters were young, I once decided that I was going to buy them a storybook of Bible stories, because I read them the mythologies of other traditions, and I felt like they should have access and understanding of, at least at a literary level, the mythologies of our own tradition. But within maybe 2 or 3 evenings of reading Bible stories, let's say she was 7 years old, maybe 8 years old at the time, had enough of it, because she's like, would talk about some woman, and Bryn would say, let's see, okay, she's going to get pregnant and she's going to have a baby, and it's going to be a boy, and then that baby is going to become famous and powerful, isn't he? So it didn't take, even the mind of a child could figure out that was the script. And so what I guess what I think you should know is that in the Bible, then again, there's all kinds of ways that this idea of that women have a complementary role to men, it's this sort of, at its very best, modern Christians try to spin it as separate but equal. And yet at its very worst, what we know in the Bible stories is that women are literally property to be done with as their owners, meaning first their father and then their husband to choose. So this is an illustration of the story of Lot's daughters when when there are angels visiting the cities of the city of Gomorrah, I believe it is, and the men of the city demand to be given sexual access to the visitors, and instead what Lot does is he says, don't bother my visitors, that would violate them, that would violate my hospitality. Here I have these virgin daughters, take them for yourselves instead. This is an illustration again of another famous Bible story. It's the story of Abraham and Sarah. They are in their 90s and haven't been able to bear a child, even though God has promised them that they will have a son who will, again, whose offspring will grow to kind of be like the stars in the sky or the sand on the beach or something like that. And so what Sarah does finally is sends her slave, Hagar, in to have sex with her husband. And so again, she can do that because there is this sense of people owning other people, and that is completely consonant throughout the Old Testament and clear into the New Testament in ways that I will talk about later. This is an illustration of King Solomon and his concubines and wives. Not that there was a lot of difference between the two. Both wives and concubines were in essence sexual slaves and kind of valued both for their ability to produce pleasure and valued for their ability to kind of do some other kinds of produce offspring. And of course there were other values in having the kind of good wife as well, but like basically in this story in the Old Testament, Solomon, who's considered to have been a godly man, the wisest man who ever lives, has, I think, 700 wives and 300 concubines, or because I don't have my notes in front of me, it may be the opposite. But needless to say, again, this is just an illustration of how constant this theme is through the Bible, of women being, in this case, collectible, being second-class kinds of beings. And then this illustrates the idea of a woman as kind of as a slave, because the Old Testament gives explicit directions for selling female slaves. Specifically, for example, it tells a Jewish man that if he sells his daughter as a slave, that that she then is to kind of remain in the custody of the person she's been sold to, and she's not to go free as a male slave would. And this is this story, again, probably familiar to all of you, is of the Midianite virgins. It's after kind of Joseph. Joseph is commanded to kind of as the army, the commander of God's army, getting direct messages from God's angel or God himself, is told to count all of the booty of war from the Midianite villages after they've kind of killed all the men. And then God is angry that they have kept women alive who are not virgins, women who might potentially be pregnant with the offspring of the Midianite men that they've just slaughtered. And so basically they're told to kill all of the children, and to kill all male children, and to kill all of the women who have been with a man, but then they are to keep the virgin girls as the spoils of war. So the general idea then is that if you look at this clear down through history, that the Bible, the Bible has had this tremendous influence, and I put this up, the Bechdel test refers to movies. Some of you may not have heard of it. What it is this test of sexism in a movie, and what it asks is, does the movie, to pass the Bechdel test of sexism, have at least two women in it who talk to each other about something besides a man? And I guess the third criterion, or the fourth criterion that's sometimes held up in are, do those two women have names? And what if you apply that Bechdel test to the Bible, what you find is that very, very few of the Bible stories meet those criteria. And then, as I started to say earlier, this kind of idea of womanhood has been passed down through history. It's affected the fathers of the Catholic Church. They then, because of this persistent belief that Eve caused sin to come into the world, that women were made from Adam's rib, that women exist for the purpose of childbearing, that even when they do bear children, they are unclean because of it, that when a woman bears a child, she's more unclean if she's had a girl baby than a boy baby. All of the stuff that's in the Bible then has kind of created this perception that women are inferior, of course. And then what happens is that the intellectual giants of Christianity have then applied their privileged position as authorities, as scholars, as people who have the luxury of thinking about philosophy and abstractions. They've applied that capacity to trying to figure out how do you justify or better articulate why it is that women are so inferior. So it's not just the fathers of the Catholic Church or the patriarchs of the Catholic Church, of course. These horrible things that are said by the founding fathers of Christianity are also said by Protestants. And that, again, this kind of continuation of this very strong perception that women suffer during childbearing because they're being punished because of Eve's sin, and that basically, even though childbearing and pregnancy is considered a punishment, that it's also exactly what Christians or women are meant to do. That's what we were made for, essentially. And in this slide that's now in front of what you see is this sort of same attitude towards women as second-class citizens being articulated by the Puritans here in the United States, and then in Seattle proper by Mark Driscoll, the kind of someone I think of as a nemesis, and a very successful megachurch minister here, Calvinist megachurch minister, who ultimately was so autocratic and so arrogant that he ended up being ousted from his church because of his conflict with church elders, and who is now in the process of starting a new church in Phoenix. So I want to just come back again to remind you that what this is about, all of this opposition to women, all of this opposition to kind of queer people, the reason that Christians are fighting so hard to oppose abortion, the reason that they've now kind of taken their success in tainting abortion and are using it to taint contraception, and and then why they use every kind of trick in the book to pretend that's not what it's about. They're talking about religious freedom. They're pretending that the most effective contraceptives operate by aborting little babies, even though that's not at all how they work. But it really is about trying to force everybody back into this box, and lest we think that it's just about women, I kind of want to remind you that children too are profoundly affected by this. As I said earlier, they're one of the kind of three kinds of people who men own, besides slaves and women, and that we have controversy swirling around us about whether people should be able to hit their children, about whether people should be able to deny their children medical care. There are laws on the books that specifically protect both of these things, even though we know them to be profoundly detrimental. There are parents who have been able to argue that sincerely held religious beliefs were the reason they had denied their child medical care, and who then kind of were able to keep their freedom and their other children until they actually managed to kill a second one of them, even in one case that came up a couple years ago. So the Bible is toxic for children in part because it's just so violent and vile if you think about it. Like this is the story that we put on nursery room walls that is supposedly a happy story that even secular people somehow think of as cute and benign. But the even worse aspect for children of the Bible is what it says about children. It says literally that as a child, you are not a person, that you don't have the right to your own existence, and to kind of, to say no. So here we have the story of Abraham getting ready to sacrifice his son Isaac, being stopped by the angel because this story is being told or was revised in a context in which the ancient Hebrew people or their predecessors were moving away from human sacrifice toward substitutionary atonement, in which they sacrificed animals instead. But the story itself only makes sense if you think of Isaac not having an independent, autonomous right to his own existence, but instead being a possession of Abraham. And the same thing is true even of the Jesus story. So if you think about Jesus being sacrificed on the cross, the idea that God can send Jesus to be a human sacrifice, again, the Father sent the Son to be the Savior of the world. What you get is now we've got sort of this more abstracted, again, idea of blood atonement or human sacrifice. Jesus does it once and for all. But again, it's this idea that the Father actually somehow it's something that belongs to him that's being sacrificed, as opposed to this autonomous being on the cross. So the root of this horrendous kind of state of affairs that we're all fighting against in different ways, trying to create a more egalitarian society, trying to ensure that women are considered fully human beings and fully autonomous, that children aren't subject to beatings, that children can have rights that are consonant with whatever their capabilities are, and that queer people are recognized as fully equal and fully kind of within the spectrum of what it means to be healthy and human. All of these, the ugliness that we're fighting around this comes from what I think of as literally text worship. And I want to talk about that for just a couple of minutes, and then I will stop. It's the idea, like before the written word, our moral and spiritual traditions were free to evolve as human consciousness evolved. But what happened, is that then, people use symbols to kind of remind themselves as iconic, to symbolize kind of divine realities that were too complex to be present in the world itself. But when we replaced these kind of symbols, visual symbols and such, with the written word, what happened is people transferred to the written texts themselves the idea of literal perfection and somehow being perfect symbols and channels for divine realities. And so that idea that then that the text is the perfect word and is a channel from God is particularly problematic, because once a given text is given that status, it is static. And then what we've done is kind of taken static texts and bound them together into static collections that were, quote, canonized. And so what you see in that context is the idea that what consciousness or a social consciousness that might have been able to evolve in the past is now invariant and immovable. Fortunately, we've moved now from the printing press, we're moving to kind of computers, and from books to kind of online platforms that actually allow some of the benefits of the written word, namely the ability to kind of communicate a set of ideas and even a specific set of words in a reliable way from between vast groups of people or people who don't even know each other and who never will. We can have those benefits, like if you think of Wikipedia, while at the same time having traditions and even texts that are living, that are evolving, that reflect our growing consciousness, changing consciousness, and that allow for the fact that what is adaptive in one context may be maladaptive in another, and that what's maladaptive in one context may be actually important and crucial in another. Like, for example, the fact that someone limiting their childbearing in the Iron Age might have been harmful to the family and to the tribe, and at this point it may be necessary for all of us to think about intentional parenthood and limiting our childbearing for to prevent literally the collapse of our planetary life support system. So this last slide is here just to remind you that beliefs have consequences, that they end up, once this kind of worldview is in place and it's invariant and inviolable, then it gets abstracted and projected onto all sorts of other things that would seemingly be irrelevant, but that follow this own kind of rabbit trail of logic to the point that people are willing to stand in the snow in this case and make their priorities known. So I've written a number of articles on these topics for online places like Alternet, Salon, Truthout, Jezebel, the Huffington Post. I aggregate all of my articles at my website, valerietarico.com, and if you'd like to get notified when a new article appears there, you can easily go to valerietarico.com and sign up. And with that, I'm going to see what happens if I actually close this screen and go back to yours.
That's perfect. Valerie, thank you so much. Do you have 10 minutes? I know you wanted to go right now. Do you have 10 minutes for a quick Q&A?
Yes, absolutely.
So remember, like we kind of did last time, either come up to the computer and talk to it, or speak really, really loud.
I can't hear you very well. So if you'd like to come closer perhaps to your microphone, that would be great.
We're going to come right to the microphone here. Can you hear this, Valerie?
Yes.
Hey, Valerie, thank you very much for your presentation. Quick question for you. My parents belong to a very evangelical church, and up until about a year ago, they were very obsessed with denigrating gay people. And then about a year ago, the preacher sort of told them to stop that because they sort of lost the fight. Now they're obsessed with trans people. And so, go figure, right? And so my wife and I are kind of joking, like, or wondering, like, who's next on the target list? Do you have any ideas about where they're going next?
Well, you know, so I actually expect that the trans fight is going to go fairly quickly because we've one of the things we learned from the fight around gay equality and marriage equality specifically is that what we need to do is to talk about our shared humanity, to talk about love, and to talk about, in the case of trans people, for example, I recently did an interview with some parents of a trans man from Texas in order to be able to kind of talk about parental love and family love, because I think that's where the power is and where the change is. what we discovered is that when people are not closeted, that and when they're just out in the world being themselves, it makes it really hard to paint them as cartoon characters or demons. Who's going to be next? Well, they've still got plenty of enemies, and one of the things, of course, as a female, often writing about gender roles and speaking about gender roles, is that you, I'm sure, have all noticed that we're not making kind of the same sort of rapid headway on gender equality. There have been some aspects of gender equality that have moved forward quickly, and then there's other places, and specifically when it has to do with our kind of women's reproductive capacity, that we're completely stalled out. And I think that that's what I expect is, as we kind of, as the religious right loses other battles, they're going to kind of double down against women in various ways. Because if you go back to that triangle that I showed you, controlling women goes back to a time kind of when people weren't even aware that trans people existed, and it is encoded in, like, you know, there's a handful, I could actually publish that handful of verses that denigrate gay people in the Bible, but like the denigration of women is pervasive throughout. And so I expect that to be a longer, harder fight.
Hello.
Hi.
And just wondering about your thoughts on the seeming contradiction, as you're saying in the Bible, we have where children are just property, and they don't have. There's instances of abortive drugs being used when adultery is suspected, things like that. To the current evangelical thoughts, where you have, no matter what, rape, incest, adultery, no abortion is seen as against the Bible, when that doesn't really seem to be the case if you see it.
Yeah. So this fight over abortion is not about the actual personhood of children. And in fact, the convergence of evangelical Protestants around opposition to abortion was really catalyzed in large part by Catholics, and it's fairly recent. So you could Google on my website. I wrote an article called "When God Was Pro-Choice and Why He Changed His Mind." That really has to do in part with the fact that pregnancy itself is no longer a black box, right? And so people realize that there is this process of fetal development going on, and then pregnancy, or Christians adapted their own beliefs and perspectives to kind of this new scientific understanding. But in reality, if you look at, for example, that abortion process in the Bible, it's a test of infidelity, right? So it's about, again, it's perfectly consonant with this idea that a specific man owns a specific woman's reproductive capacity. In that Old Testament verse, what he's doing is doing the same thing. It's kind of constant, you know, like you can kill her, you could stone her if you can figure out that she's had sex with a woman before, or with a man before marriage. Afterwards, if you think she might have had sex with someone else and you don't want to have her stoned, you can give her this abortifacient, right? And the idea, again, is then what you're doing is creating this capacity for purebred pups.
Okay. Thanks, Valerie. I really appreciate you making time for us. My question was, do you feel that the hardcore right is as dangerous as the hardcore left? Are they equally as dangerous? Like the hardcore left being those that refuse to recognize that religion has any impact. Like if you go to loonwatch.com or something, you know, they say that Islam has absolutely zero to do with terrorism. And then on the right, those that are just defending their values, and are they equally as dangerous, or do you combat one more than the other?
Well, I personally think that the far right in this country is more dangerous, in part because they're armed and the left isn't. Clearly, you know, It's a hard question to answer, in part because what you have to do is to have some sort of extreme ideology coupled with power. And so I joke about them being armed, but I'm also serious. The far left isn't anywhere close to being able to seize control of the reins of power in this country and to rule according to like anarchist principles or something like that. I think they are dangerous in large part because, just like the right, they are not accountable to evidence, and so are really incapable of helping us move towards a future that is based on optimizing human well-being and optimizing the well-being of the broader web of life in our planetary life support system, because they are unwilling and unable to assess the real world contingencies that govern people's lives, or to engage in a process of inquiry that's actually self-correcting. So when I look at the left-wing attitudes towards Islam, I think, frankly, it makes me a little crazy, because it flies in the face of all evidence that, in fact, Islam is a pernicious and dangerous mind virus, as is Christianity. And I think that the left wing's defense of Islam comes from this, it's kind of this reactive, like, the enemy of my enemy. Since right-wing Christians recognize the power of religion, and they recognize the power of Islam to actually motivate murder, and then the left reacts against the right by finding ways and excuses to defend it. And I think on both sides of the spectrum, what you have is an inability of people to differentiate Islam from Muslims, right? So the right wing says Islam's bad, therefore Muslims are all bad. The left says, well, I know a lot of people who are Muslims who are kind and loving and compassionate and generous and decent people, and who live out their lives in peace. Therefore, Islam itself is benign. So it's a failure of the capacity to differentiate criticism of an ideology and opposition to an ideology, to differentiate ideology from people.
Do we have one more, Valerie? Time for one more?
Yeah. Hi, Valerie. Thanks again for the fascinating talk. I had a question about your background. As Rob was reading your bio, I was curious, as someone who also works in healthcare, I was wondering, during your time at Seattle Children's, how was the reaction, or whether it was public, that you were openly secular? And really, if you could talk about secularism within the healthcare field, that would be fantastic. Thank you.
My own experience is that, working in mental health, I would guess that most mental health professionals at the kind of PhD level or at the MD level are either secular or very modernist in their religion. Now, that's not entirely true. We know, for example, that Michelle Bachmann's husband runs a clinic of kind of mental health professionals who kind of are grounded in biblical ignorance, and that Christian colleges and universities are working hard to create Bible-based mental health services, and that people who are seeking mental health services need to be careful about the biases of the person to whom they entrust their vulnerability. But in reality, science, the scientific method, and even though I think of psychology as an imperfect science, it just offers so much better explanations for the complexity of human behavior than the notions of sin and salvation. So I think I had it pretty easy in that I evolved out of Christianity kind of gradually over time, as leaving my extremely biblical literist fundamentalist community, going to Wheaton College, where it was still kind of narrow enough that I felt safe to inquire, and yet by the time I left there, I had evolved a very idiosyncratic form of faith. And then, by the time I came out to Seattle, which is some of the most secular places, one of the most secular places in the country, and was then surrounded by a lot of people who were in medicine as secular people, or certainly at least kind of putting their religion on the back burner. So I feel like I haven't had to deal with some of the challenges that are faced by people living in, say Alabama, where 97% of Alabamans self-identify as Christian or God believers. I forget which it is. There's really more room in some communities, and I hope that Seattle kind of represents the way for the future, because here someone can be genuinely secular and even out secular, and the Christians themselves are habituated enough to it that it doesn't feel like it's a threat to employment, or kind of that it would result in someone being shunned by their neighbors or ending up socially isolated.
I just want to share a quick story before we go, and this is for the group too. My wife's in marketing. She travels around throughout the country for various marketing tasks, and she's actually in Michigan, and one of the companies that their company or whatever, one of the clients they're looking at is a high school, and is a private Christian school. So when we listen to Valerie's presentation today, and sometimes I think people get the sense of, well, it's not going to affect me, or no one around here is like that. This is a school in Michigan, which, we can drive to at any time. In the school, the way they teach is they'll have open hall lectures, but women are not able to give lectures unless a man invites them in to give a lecture. That's the only time they can give lectures. Now, it was hard, this is a couple weeks ago when she visited this place, and this was their big selling point. This is their marketing thing, is we want to market that we are essentially telling women they have no right speaking to public forums unless men invite them in first. So like for me, that was very powerful. And Valerie, I don't know if you want to comment on that, but this is Michigan in a high school. It's hard for me to understand why parents today would think that's a good model.
I think that people who have had a fairly benign experience of Christianity, oftentimes, people who are modernist Christians in the mainline traditions, don't really understand what the Bible says. Most Christians don't read the Bible, right? Especially the ugly parts. You have, mercifully, we have kind of people cherry picking, but what they don't realize then is that kind of there's this whole array of Christianity that treats much more of the Bible as literally perfect than what they themselves might accept. And unfortunately, parochial schools are often subsidized and cheaper than sending a child to a comparable, private school that is secular or that is simply kind of focused on good academics. And so people get sucked in. And I think that's one of the reasons why it's so important that those of us who have broken free, or who somehow managed to grow up without imbibing this toxin, need to find ways to help create space for diversity, need to create space for paths out, because people get into that, and then as I kind of said earlier, it really does create a worldview that just doesn't have paths out.
Agreed. Valerie, thank you so much. Everyone here, ValerieTarico.com. She's constantly writing fantastic blogs. Buy her books. They're fantastic. I can't say enough about Valerie. She also has a great blog where she quotes David Fitzgerald on the Christ myth theory for the Huffington Post, which did really, really well and really helped, the mythicist position. So Valerie, thank you again so much for joining us.
Absolutely.
We definitely want to get you here in person. I will send you an email. This will be recorded, so if you want to use it in the future, it's all yours. But thank you again, and have a good night.
Thank you all.